A Light Lunch with Chris West.
Academy FM.
I'm pleased to be speaking once again to an author who writes excellent books about some amazing artists and bands. Good afternoon, Peter Chexfield.
Good afternoon, Chris. Good to be back.
Now, Peter, you've written books about the Searchers, Herman Hermits, the UK 60s, the Beatles, many other groups. How can you produce so many books in such a small space of time?
I don't know. I suppose I'm a workaholic in a way. My other half, she'll be watching, I don't know, Vera or something on the telly, and I'll finish a book and I'll say, right, that's it for 3 months. You know, within 2 or 3 weeks, I'll start making notes. You know, and gradually I've got a book. You know, so that's got up myself. So.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And your latest book is about the world's greatest rock and roll band, which focus on one of the original members. The book is The Rolling Stones, The Brian Jones Years. Now, who was Brian Jones?
Oh, very interesting character. He was, the Rolling Stones were hyped, you know, as working class heroes, but he was from Cheltenham, you know, from a very privileged background, you know, and Mick Jagger was middle class really and still is, but he was a blues enthusiast and probably the most purist of the band originally. He was the first white, almost certainly the first white guy in this country to play slide blues guitar, you know, when people saw it. And when Mick and Keith first saw it, you know, they just couldn't believe their eyes and ears, you know. So.
And how did Mick and Keith and the rest of the band get to meet Brian Jones?
Well, Brian Jones, he formed a band. I mean, he was the first member in a way, and he put an ad in a paper, and an early member called Ian Stewart, who was a piano player, he joined. But then Mick and Keith, I don't think they answered the ad, but they saw him play. Alexis Corner used to have a blues and jazz group, and anyone could get up, you know, and Brian Jones got up, Mick and Keith occasionally, Paul Jones, Jack Bruce, people like that. Yeah, they become friends, yeah, and they formed a band. I suppose 6 to 9 months later, they acquired Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts, and that's the lineup that got them famous.
And I've read somewhere, perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, that he originally asked Paul Jones to be the frontman of the Rolling Stones.
I don't know about as the Rolling Stones, but certainly as, you know, the front man of the band he had in mind before he met Mick and Keith. So yeah, whether they'd been called the Rolling Stones or not, I don't know. But yeah, they used to actually perform as a duo. When they were unknown. Paul Jones and Brian Jones. Yeah. And Paul Jones, his real name isn't Jones. It's actually Paul Pond. So,
interesting. Interesting.
Yeah.
In your book, you've got detailed information about the early recordings. Come On was the first single. Who was the band's influence by, and when did they actually start writing their own material?
Well, the Come On was a Chuck Berry song, quite a mediocre Chuck Berry song, not an obvious song to cover really, but it was okay, it did okay. Got to number 21 in the charts. Well, their early songwriting, actually, one forward a little bit. Their second single was I Wanna Be Your Man. And their manager, Andrew Oldham, he knew the Beatles vaguely, you know, from before working with the Stones, because he worked with Brian Epstein. And they'd already recorded Come On, and he had a word with John and Paul and said, we need a follow-up. And they said, well, we got something sort of half-finished that might be useful. And they went down to the studio, I think it was just a practice studio, met the rest of the Stones, and said, right, we're just going to go off into the corner and finish it. And Mick and Keith thought, wow, is it that easy? Yeah, and that really spurred on that and their manager, Andrew Oldham. But most of the early songs, they tend to be, you know, very pop, very Beatley. It took a year or so before they started writing, you know, more tougher, you know, rock, rhythm and blues songs.
Well, that's really interesting. And was Brian Jones popular with the other band members and the fans?
Certainly with the fans, you know. He was up there with Mick, perhaps more popular than Mick, you know. But I think they had a love-hate relationship. He could be very moody, you know. He's probably, you know, these days he'd probably be diagnosed with bipolar or something, you know, or Asperger's. But you know, in those days, you know, someone was just moody, and I think it was difficult to get along with, and and he wanted to be the leader, Brian Jones, and he was in a way when he started the group. But obviously, once Mick and Keith started writing songs, and Brian tried, but he apparently wasn't much of a songwriter. And they got more money and they got all the attention for writing the songs, and Keith played more lead guitar, and so he did more of the solos, and obviously Mick was the front man, so yeah, and there was a bit of animosity between them there over that.
And looking through your book, you've got a list of the gigs that the Rolling Stones did, and performing in 1963, most of the gigs were around the London area, but there was a couple of gigs which were down in this area. On the 15th of August 1963, they performed in Dreamland. Which was great.
Yeah.
And the other one I was really interested about, on the 5th of September 1963, they performed at the Strand Palais in Walmer Deal.
Yeah.
Which is now a garage. It's auto-based. But they were a great live band, weren't they, in the early days?
Oh, yeah. That's where they established their reputation, really, as the live band. I mean, I don't want to put down the Beatles or the Dave Clark Five or the Searchers. They were good live in their own way, but... you see some of this early footage of the Rolling Stones. Yeah, they had a power and charisma that could, wipe the floor with pretty much all the opposition. Yeah.
Did Brian Jones actually lead the Rolling Stones, or was he sacked?
He's lost interest around about early 1966 in playing the guitar, and they were a guitar band, and that should have been disastrous. But it wasn't, because he could pick up pretty much any instrument and learn it. And during 66 and 67, he played a sitar on one of their big hits, Paint It Black, a dulcimer, which is played flat on your lap, on a song called Lady Jane. He played organ, he was a good harmonica player, he played recorder on Ruby Tuesday. So throughout 66 and 67... it actually helps that he was bored with the guitar, because he come up with all these different sounds, you understand. But then by 1968, they wanted to get back to basics, move away from all the psychedelia and the pop thing. They did Jumpin' Jack Flash and Sympathy for the Devil and things like that. And that wasn't his type of thing, and there was only really room for a guitar. And gradually he got bored and he turned up less and less, and it was almost by mutual consent. I think he probably saw it coming, and he was getting heavily into drugs. More, I mean, when Keith Richards turns around to someone and says you're taking too much drugs, you know you're overdoing it.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, and then. Bill Wyman actually was always the most lawless friend of Brian Jones, although very opposite personalities. But one night Mick, Keith and Charlie, they drove over to where Brian was living, and said, you're out the band, but you're going to get a royalty cut and all that. There was a lot of talk at the time. Apparently, he was going to form a band with various other people, but other people who jammed with him at the time, like the late John Mayall, who died recently, Alexis Corner, said he couldn't really play guitar anymore, and he was too messed up, to do much. Cut long story short, 6 weeks after he was fired, he died. He drowned down a swimming pool.
Yes, yeah, very sad. Peter, this is a really, really interesting book, and you must have the Rolling Stones in your blood. You must be a big fan of the Rolling Stones, and it is a must for anyone who is a fan of the Rolling Stones, this book, because there is just so much information in there about the music, about the Rolling Stones, and also, as I say, Brian Jones years as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you briefly how I got into the Rolling Stones. I was born in 1963, so I suppose around about the time the Beatles and the Stones and everyone was emerging. But in 1966, an album came out called Big Hits, High Tide and Green Grass, which was a great hits thing. And my parents bought that. And I don't even remember first hearing it. It was always playing, and as soon as I could play records, they had the Beatles and Elvis and Manfred Mann and Gene Pitney, Frankie Valli, all this wonderful music. But that was the album I nearly always went to. So it really is in my DNA since I was 3 or 4. That album, and then gradually, more of their music. So yeah, it really is.
That's really interesting, to find out. Obviously, all about Brian Jones, but all about the Rolling Stones. The book is The Rolling Stones: The Brian Jones Years. And how can people purchase it?
From Amazon. biggest bookshop in the world. But I've also got a website. If they Google my name, Peter Checksfield, they easily find it. So if you can't get it from Amazon or don't use Amazon, you know, I can sort something out. Yeah.
What is the next book then?
I'm actually about halfway through something on Cliff Richard and the Shadows,
Wow.
and I was gonna finish that, and but what made me do the Rolling Stones instead? They've been on tour recently in America, and I've been reading the reports and watching the videos, and Mick Jagger and Keith Richards to a certain extent. I mean, they're 80, 81, and they were sensational, the shows, and it was like an itch I couldn't scratch. I thought, I've got to do this book. So I'll return. Sorry, Cliff, but I'll return to Cliff Richard and the Shadows probably next year.
Oh, that's fantastic. And we look forward to that because there is a lot of our listeners that are big Cliff Richard fan. Well, Peter, thank you very much for this excellent book, and thank you very much for the excellent information.
Thank you, Chris, as always.